So welcome everybody. Welcome to the first ever webinar Wednesday. Super excited to get this thing going again. We're going to be featuring some amazing community members, and today we have Diana. She is co-founder and head of product at Correlated, and she'll be sharing a little bit about product-led tech stack and how to really select for that. I'm going to pass it off to Diana. Diana, welcome. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the questions below in the chat box, and then we're going to capture some questions later after the session is over. I'm also going to be recording this and sharing it out to everybody right after. So Diana, you have the stage, the virtual stage.
Alrighty, thanks for the intro. I'm just going to start diving in, and if you have any questions, we can kind of cover some of them depending on kind of the cadence. So feel free to interrupt me. So the topic today that we want to cover is how to choose a tech stack for product-led go-to-market. And before we kind of dive into that, I think it's kind of important to talk about why would you even need a different tech stack for PLG and how is it different? So if you think about like traditional sales organizations, usually they'll have like a CRM. So this is a lot of like human to human interaction. You might be storing things like how many calls did you have? How many emails did you have? And then someone manually goes in there, changes the opportunity, changes that information. So all of that is human centric. And over time, there have been a lot of different companies that kind of build on top of the CRM that automate things. So maybe you'll have like a Marketo or a HubSpot that do drip campaigns. You'll have like an Outreach or a Sales Loft that does sales cadences. And everything kind of comes together to create this go-to-market machine that's a combination of human touch as well as automation. And what really makes PLG different is everything is product driven, right? So you have a lot of information about what people are doing in your product. You have a lot more context about why you should be talking to them. So really PLG is all focused around how do you actually leverage the product as kind of a selling vehicle. And one of the most important things there is how do you actually collect and act on product data. So the thing that I like to, yes, question?
Do you mean to share your screen?
Oh, am I not sharing my screen?
No, you're not.
Oh, wow, wonderful.
No problem. Just
well,
want to make sure. There it is.
There we go. Well, I think it's the first webinar, getting back to things. So really quickly, this is just a graphic around kind of PLG. You have CRMs, automation, drip campaign, sales cadences. Cool. So what I really think is important when you think about the tech stack that you're trying to choose for PLG go-to-market is really thinking about operationalizing your PLG go-to-market. So when you think about a traditional PLG motion, this is like a really common one. You have someone who's coming in, they're using your freemium or free trial, they're trying to convert to paid, and then they're trying to expand. And what it means to operationalize a go-to-market is, as before, when you had kind of the human to human and automation touch, you kind of want to combine those two and really just make sure that you're always kind of pushing customers throughout this entire funnel and making sure everyone kind of continues to move along in their journey. And so what that might look like is if someone's coming in with freemium, you're going to kind of identify all of the mid-market to enterprise companies, and you care about those. So you're going to try to do human interaction there, but everyone else, you're actually going to do automated nurture. When they convert to paid, you might do something like, I want to figure out all the people who are mid-market enterprise, but they're actually having trouble converting to paid. So have a human go in and actually push them towards those milestones. And then finally on expansion, you might actually want to have a human go in and actually lead that expansion motion, just because with expansion, oftentimes it's a larger deal. So you kind of want to have people really buy into the use case, involve the right stakeholders. So that is often a human guided expansion. But throughout all of these different stages, you also have this, what I would call automated data driven nurture to basically operationalize PLG go to market, because having humans go in and talk to every single user is just not sustainable. So one of the biggest mistakes I see people do is what I call boiling the ocean. And I think traditionally, this works for certain companies, but it doesn't really work super well as the only go-to-market motion in PLG. So two common examples of boiling the ocean are, outbound calling and email blasting. And I would say that you should still, in some cases, do this. For example, at Correlated, we do actually do outbounding, and we do it because we know the target persona that we're going after. So we'll do outbounding for if we know the exact persona we want. They tend to be a little bit more mid-market enterprise, not SMB, and that's when we'll do outbounding. The second kind of example of like boiling the ocean is all-encompassing drip campaigns. And this is like super common. Like anytime you sign up for a product-led growth company or product, you'll end up getting like 7 emails over the span of 14 days that are all just automated. And the problem with these drip campaigns is they're not very relevant for a couple different reasons. You might have a user come in and they're not really ready to use the product yet, but they're just looking around, and you're sending them these drip campaigns trying to get them to use the product, but they're not even ready. And the second piece is all these drip campaigns you're sending them are not based on what they're doing in your product. So really, I think the best way to kind of do PLG go to market going forward, and there are a lot of like new tools that enable this, is to really make drip campaigns more personalized and timely. So you don't need to be emailing someone if they signed up and ultimately did nothing in your product. And also to kind of just be more efficient about who you're actually calling and who you're actually emailing. So what I like to think about as the best kind of golden bullet, is that the right idiom, is this idea of smart triage. So when someone comes in, they're using your product. And when I talk about like product data, this is like any type of engagement data, right? So it could be like they're in your product, they could be viewing your website, they could be doing a lot of different things, and all of that kind of becomes your data that you actually want to use to drive the smart triage. And a really common thing that we see people do is they'll augment that data with some firmographic data and figure out who's a large customer, who's an SMB, who's unknown. And for unknown customers, this is a really interesting case because a lot of times in PLG, you might have someone sign up with their Gmail, or like in open source, you have someone not even give you information. So there's a lot of unknown customers where there might actually be gold there. But when you're doing these unknown customers, it's just impossible to talk to everybody. So what you might do there is for unknown customers, you'll send everybody to these automated campaigns that kind of keep pushing them towards a milestone of activation. But if they start becoming really engaged, they become like super users, they're showing all the right kind of key milestones, then you push them more towards a personalized drip campaign where you're actually trying to get them on the phone to talk to a salesperson so that you can qualify them. For like large enterprise and SMB customers, you might actually just always send large enterprise customers to sales, or for SMBs, you might actually want to send someone who's super engaged, can become like a case study to sales engagement. So this is really kind of, I think, the model that you should be thinking about when you're doing PLG CRM. It's really around how do I route people to the right place, and how do I really spend sales time on the right kind of customers. So now that we're going to talk about tech stack. So when I think about tech stack, there are 3 main things your tech stack should be able to do. One is to track data in a way that's easily consumable by other tools. So I see a lot of people choose data vendors that kind of do the full stack. So they'll do the collection, they'll do the analysis, and then they'll do some, whatever action that they care about, depending on whatever persona they're selling to. The problem with focusing on using just platforms like that is that then when you want to actually use other tools, that data is now stuck in that application. So I think it's just really important when you think about any kind of tool you're using, if it's going to be kind of like your only source of usage data, you want one that's easily that can easily be tapped into. Otherwise, it becomes a huge problem. On the second piece, exposing data in views that different personas can understand. I think a lot of people, they try to get a tech tool that will serve every single persona, and that just doesn't really work. One of the most common examples is you'll get Looker and you build a bunch of reports, and then you want salespeople to look at Looker reports. And very few salespeople have time to do that, just because for them, they're all about like relationship building. They're going to spend all their time emailing, calling up people, and expecting them to look at reports is basically a way, I think, for data to kind of go into like a black box and no one ever looks at it. So I think it's really important to really think about the personas and invest in views that personas can understand. And then finally, once you have 1 and 2 done, I think the last point is you can't have all this data and not do anything with it. So you want to make sure you also have tooling or processes that help you actually execute on the data that you've collected. So in terms of data collection, this is kind of, I'm going to present a very opinionated data model based on kind of all the different customers that we've talked to. And I do think that it kind of encompasses most of the PLG use cases, but of course, like you might have different use cases, so take it with a grain of salt. But essentially the 2 main data sources that matter the most are events. So this is like what are customers doing, and events are typically tagged to like a timestamp. So at like 2 o'clock, someone signed in. And then there's a second class, which is firmographics. And this really just describes the state of a customer. And so this might be things like number of employees, or for us, like number of workflows that they've created. Any kind of current state, we kind of treat as a firmographic. So there's time-stamped events, and then there's a state of what that customer is like right now. And a couple common vendors that I think are great on the event side are Segment and RudderStack. RudderStack's open source. Segment, because it's not open source, tends to get expensive with scale. But I do think Segment is a great tool to get started with. A lot of people use it. It's very, very tested. And then some other options, Heap and Amplitude. And we also see people building their own, which I think is very difficult, but you could do it if you wanted to. But those are some of the event vendors. For the firmographic space, Salesforce and HubSpot are obviously like the main sources of firmographic data. And Snowflake, I think, is really a rising, I would call it a source of truth that's becoming really, really relevant in the firmographic space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So Snowflake is really a CDW, and I'd say Snowflake is just one example. Internally at Correlated, we actually use BigQuery. So you could use any of those. BigQuery is really great because it can connect to a lot of different data sources across Google Cloud. So if you're using like Postgres on Google Cloud, you can use BigQuery to do like a lot of really cool things like external queries. So BigQuery is a great product, but Snowflake is also super great. And a lot of people use it. But the reason why you really want a CDW is with PLG, one of the biggest differences between PLG and traditional sales is your users are coming into your product. So your source of truth of who your users are is no longer necessarily Salesforce. Like you might be copying all of your users into Salesforce, but at the end of the day, that source of truth, the most accurate version of who your users are actually lives in your product and not in Salesforce. The other problem with Salesforce is you have a lot of people like inputting their own like version of like different companies. You have like 3 of the same company. Whereas in your product, that's really just dependent on how your users have self-organized themselves. So that's kind of why the CDW is great. It's just a great way to pipe all of your information into kind of a warehouse where you can access it in a lot of different ways. You can hook it up to intelligence tools. You can use a lot of different data modeling tools. And it's just a lot more powerful than continuing to rely on your CRM as necessarily the main source of truth. So I think this is a really important key trend and something to think about. So going back to data collection, just one final point on firmographics. Firmographics is actually, I would say when we look at customers, they kind of start with events, right? Like it's kind of easy to like put segment into your product. And then the firmographic data that tells you which customers matter based on like how many employees they have. A lot of the earlier customers don't have this, but the later customers, the more mature companies tend to have this, and it's really useful. And two of the most common vendors we see are Clearbit and ZoomInfo. There are others, but I think those two are kind of the most common. The one caveat is they are kind of expensive. So I think that's the main reason why we don't see a lot of startups using it compared to kind of more mid-market enterprise. So we talked about Smart Triage earlier, and one of the key things about Smart Triage is you're looking at events, but you're also looking at firmographics. So like kind of the outcome you want to be able to do is you want to be able to say, if a customer is coming in and they're signing in and they have more than 250 employees, I want to do something. So you need a combination of events and firmographics, and these data sources are often different. So the most important thing that I think you want to think about before you even start building your tech stack is what is that unifying ID? How do I actually combine events with firmographics? So an example is here, like if you have segment, you have a user ID, and you actually want to pipe that user ID into Salesforce, because otherwise you're never going to be able to join all that firmographic data that lives in Salesforce with your events. So that's a unique customer ID. And customer, I think, is like a really loaded term. So in the Salesforce world, you had like accounts, you had multiple contacts and going into an account. And then on the side, you have leads. And, everybody has like a love-hate relationship with leads. I'm not really sure why they still have it, but anyway, leads are there. And that's kind of the old Salesforce world model. But in the PLG world, you have all these users coming in from the bottom. They're signing up for your product, and then they create an organization and they invite different users. So now they have this like mapping of organizations to users. And some users might actually be members of multiple organizations. And then on top of that, an account might actually have multiple organizations. So this is like a really common PLG model that we've seen, like maybe for organizations. For you, it might be like teams, or it could be workspaces. But anyway, there's always kind of this 3-tier way of thinking about PLG accounts. So really, our suggested model of how you should do this is you have a user, they sign up, and at that time, you give them that unique user ID. And this is the user ID that if you end up like piping any data into like other data sources, you actually want to just unify it. So even if like in Salesforce, you have like your Salesforce user ID or contact ID, you actually want to pipe this user ID into Salesforce as well. Once you create that user and they go ahead and create an organization, you're going to assign that unique organization an ID as well. So if anyone gets invited to that organization, they get linked to that unique organization ID, and they also get their own unique user ID. And then on top of that, you actually have a different ID, the account ID, that maps to the organization ID. So this is kind of the model that we've seen most commonly occur in PLG. One other really common data model we've seen of, like, your question is probably like, okay, well, how would I store this information in Salesforce? So what people do is they'll have the user as a contact in Salesforce, then they'll create a custom object that basically represents their organizations, and they'll have unique organization IDs within that custom object, and then they'll map the account over to all of the different organizations that they're tied to. So you'll kind of have a custom object that acts as that second level in that data model. I see something in chat. Should I stop or keep going?
Yeah, I mean, it's a few slides back around. I mean, Alex asked, where do you see Mixpanel fitting into the PLG stack?
Yes, I think I will actually cover that very shortly. And if I don't,
Sweet.
I will remind me to cover it again. Here it is, this slide. So that first entire section was all about tracking data. How should you like tag users? The second piece that we had mentioned that was important when you think about a tech stack is, how do you actually expose that useful data to different personas? So three most common personas that we see involved in PLG are, first, product and growth. And they tend to be a little bit, I would say, more like SQL friendly. So they probably know how to play with data. They think about data a lot more often. In the middle, you have customer success. So people who are trying to reduce churn, find expansion opportunities sometimes. And then you have sales. So on the product and growth side, I would call Mixpanel kind of like a traditional, more of a BI tool. I know they have like a lot of functions that like try to like map users and all of that. I personally found that like it's a very powerful tool, but you have to be like a super user to know how to use a lot of those functions. And really at the end of the day, I've never really heard salespeople going into Mixpanel. So I would really classify Mixpanel more as a BI tool that's built for product growth, data analyst, that type. And so in this particular space, we have Looker, Mode, Mixpanel, and then Amplitude, who just went public. So it's pretty crazy to see companies go public in this space, but that's where I'd classify Mixpanel. In the middle, you have customer success. There have been a lot of actually really interesting new vendors in customer success that I think are really great for PLG. Vitally, they do a really good view that shows you like product usage metrics and how well a customer is doing. You have Catalyst that does more process-oriented things. So I think with customer success, the main difference between customer success and product/growth is customer success doesn't care about metrics at a holistic level. They care about it on a per user or per company level. And they also care about project management. So they want to make sure that they're actually talking to the right customers. So that's why the two views are very different. And then with sales is also similarly, like they care about the companies that they're assigned. So they're in Salesforce. I think in my mind, all of the vendors in PLG right now for sales are actually very new. So that's where we live. But overall, like sales also similarly doesn't need kind of the holistic like dashboarding. They just want to know, I want to know what customers to talk to and why. So sales and I think customer success are a little bit more related, whereas product and growth tend to use more of these data power tools. So reverse ETL is this, hopefully all of you have maybe heard of it, but I took this out of the Redpoint presentation because I think it really does describe kind of the flow of data. The benefit of reverse ETL is that it just makes it really easy to take your data from a Snowflake data warehouse and then pipe it into a downstream application that is more for those personas. So like if your customer success team is living in Gainsight, like they're seeing data that's relevant to them in the tools that they use. So I think reverse ETL is a really great solution to kind of make sure all of your data is kind of being piped into tools that are actually useful for the different personas that you're trying to serve. And then high touch and census are pretty big in that space, as is Grouperoo. So I think this is a good chart for reverse ETL. So finally, once you've kind of figured out like how you want to model your data and then how you want to pipe it over to like the people you care about, I think that this is the third most important thing to think about and something not to be ignored, which is it's really great to have a bunch of different graphs, but the problem with graphs is people have to go look at them. And obviously like sales teams or customer success teams, that's not their expertise to go in and look at data every day. So there are a couple I would call newer vendors in this space. that do a lot of really cool things. Like in-app notifications, I think is really powerful. So when someone's doing something interesting in your app, sending them a notification right where they are so that they can get, relevant insights. So Pendo, app queues, intercom, all kind of good options in that space. The second piece, I think, around marketing campaigns, Marketo and HubSpot, they do have the ability to take in kind of product metrics and then pipe things into campaigns. I would say that like Marketo and HubSpot, like, I don't know, I can't exactly remember when HubSpot was founded, but it's got to be like over 10 years now. So the problem I think with some of these platforms is that they are very powerful, but they're also not necessarily built for the new PLG world. So you have to be kind of a pretty advanced user to be able to use some of those tools. So even though you can get there, I do think it's a little bit more difficult. And then this is also the space that Correlated sits in. So when data comes in, we basically allow you to take action by either doing a direct email, an outreach or sales off, or you get a Slack notification. So I think this action space is less crowded, but very, very important and really interesting to think about. So some other vendors in kind of this action space are like kind of more of the like the Zapiers of the world, or Zapier, Zapier, Tray.io, Workato are kind of also in this particular space. So just to like recap on kind of what you should be thinking about when you're building a basic PLG tech stack, I'd say on the data collection side, absolutely need an event collection vendor. Segment or RudderStack are really, I would say, the most common ones we see. So choose an event collection vendor. The CDW, I think if you're a startup under like the size authority, you could probably wait. I just don't think it's necessary. Startups have a lot of stuff to do and they don't have time to really build out a CDW at that time. The CRM, also vital. It's really interesting. We actually see some startups who actually don't have a CRM. I think you ultimately eventually need one. So getting that right in the beginning when you like don't have too much like data just like lying around is a really great idea. So either Salesforce or HubSpot. And then reverse ETL I think is optional right now. Just if you have a lot of data in your data warehouse, it's a good option to consider. In the middle, I think the BI analytics space, super useful. Looker mode, if you're using Mixpanel is great too. So any one of those, just so that you can actually do more, I would call deep diving into the data and finding trends. And then finally, this data action space, marketing, HubSpot or Marketo also, I personally think required for PLG. The in-app push thing, I think, is really more for when you're a little bit more mature as a company and your product kind of has that PLG flywheel. That's kind of the time when I think an in-app push is more interesting. I think in the beginning, it's a little bit of a nice to have. And then finally, with the human assisted touch with like Slack or like having the salespeople reach out, I think this is really more important once you actually have revenue targets. So once you have revenue targets and you know you're going to have to be talking to customers, that's the time when you want to actually start thinking about human assisted data action tools. And then just a plug about Correlated. Essentially what we do is we kind of sit in the middle of data intelligence and data action. So we'll ingest a lot of data from the data collection side. We present this unified like PLG first customer view. And then we use that engine to basically automate the human assisted side. So you can combine the automation of sales, like outreach and Salesloft with Slack. So that's kind of where we sit in. So that's the crux of the presentation that I had created. And I'd love to just maybe have, answer questions, have some discussion about what you all have been seeing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the comments or just share with everybody exactly what your question is. Or since we wanted this to be interactive, feel free to also, I mean, if you want to jump in and unmute yourself to ask a question.
Well, I'll just make an observation. I'm a drummer at the wrong gig. I'm actually a principal engineer, and we are a company at PagerDuty who's very interested in product-led growth. In fact, my big interest is on the architecture, the engineering architecture, to make it easier for us to mutate our product and have a shorter cycle time so that we can actually run our flywheel faster. That's why I came here, but this isn't the tech stack. But I do want to say, even though I don't actually have expertise to be able to really interact with your content, this is inspiring and I thank you for it. And I will be recommending this program to people who are more focused on our marketing and outreach in our org. I ended up being here for the wrong reasons, but it was very beneficial. So thank you.
Oh, no problem. I mean, what you're thinking about sounds really interesting too. So that sounds like another talk we should do.
Things like cycle time as a leading indicator of your ability to run a flywheel, which is very different from things like the number of people who are able to convert without intervention from a human and so on. These are all really interesting problems, but they're not exactly the same problem as what kind of tech stack allows you to collect the data that you need in order to
Right.
the product-led growth business. So
Right.
I'll turn it over now to people who are here for your specific content, but thank you.
The one vendor I would consider you could consider is there are people who are kind of more trying to help you find like machine learning on data. So if you're like trying to do like cycle time, stuff like that, Mad Kudu is like an option. But I one thing that we've discovered is we actually do some of this like data crunching for our own customers too. So we'll help them figure out how do you like what are the key signals that indicate that someone is about to convert, or what are the key indicators of someone who's not converting. And what we've discovered as the number one key thing is like how often are they using the product, which is why we just like have the score, and it's like surprisingly useful. So I think there's like a limit to like overthinking it, but it's just funny to like discover that it's sometimes not rocket science.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Joshua has a question around a tool that you mentioned earlier that sounded like avocado. You mentioned one, and is it Workato?
Workato, yes. Yes. I think a lot like Workato and Trey, my caveat is one of the important things to think about is like the expertise of your team. So Workato and Trey are more, I would say, like technical, like you have to learn the tool, you have to like get trained on it. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Awesome. There's a question, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, from Michael. Did you want to just unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, since it's a few sentences there?
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to. So I think I've been digging a little bit deeper into, how a PLG strategy can be strengthened by a customer support strategy. And I think a lot of the research that I've been seeing today is predominantly focused on customer onboarding and customer education. So thinking about, digital adoption platforms such as a WalkMe or a Pendo, and then perhaps, education that can be stored in self-serve help centers such as a Zendesk or something else. What I'm curious to learn is like, are there any other similarities or differences you've noticed in a tech stack that is facilitating the specific cause? Or are there any key buckets within the customer support branch that you would also consider when considering supporting users or customers in a PLG context?
Yeah, I think the main thing about PLG and why it's different is that the volume of people coming in and using your product is just that much higher. So like you can't do things like MQLs and like expect your salespeople to call everybody up. So I think that's why you see like tools like Intercom's a great tool for PLG, all those in-app guides, the onboarding stuff. I think all of that is important. One of the biggest well, I wouldn't say it's not a mistake, it's more of a gap that I think a lot of these kind of PLG strategy, research stuff miss is a lot of PLG is actually not necessarily onboarding. It's also conversion and expansion. So how do I get someone who's free to expand into being paid and to expand into paying more? Like that's really when the PLG flywheel is working. So I think in that way, actually non-PLG and PLG stacks actually end up starting to look really similar, because at the non-PLG world, you're also trying to expand as you are in the PLG world. So I think in the beginning, like all the customer onboarding stuff, that's a little bit more unique to PLG. But once you get into the product, all the things around like, how do I know what the customers are doing? How do I send them personalized emails? Do I send them in-app like suggestions? All of that is, I think, similar between non-PLG and PLG, and non-PLG companies should be adopting these kind of tools too.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions from anyone else? You were already getting there. Oh, I think Alex just unmuted yourself. Go ahead. Alex? Is it?
I didn't want to interrupt it in case he popped on. Hi.
Sorry.
I was having a
Oh,
little
are you there?
microphone issues
Okay.
there. Thank you for the presentation, Diana. That was amazing. So succinct and really appreciate it. My question is, for companies pivoting from or transitioning to the PLG model from a more traditional sales model, which tools, which part of the stack do you think is most impactful? Or, do you have tactics on how to make that transition?
Yeah, we actually hear about this a lot with customers. I think the main reason is that most startups honestly don't start PLG because it's so hard to get that onboarding right, and to get all those flows correct. It's just like a huge investment. So a lot of companies, when they first start out, they'll start out with like just a product and they like just hand onboard people on. So I think that makes a lot of sense that you're making that transition. I'd say the most important thing to get right is really points 1 and 2. So the event tracking, being able to actually have time series events of what people are doing and have that actually be useful. So we often see like people tracking like, oh, a modal opened or a modal closed. Like that's not useful stuff. It's okay to track it for like product managers or for like other tools that you're doing. But at the end of the day, like you want to be able to track like feature usage. So did someone use a feature? When did they use it? The second piece that I think is really important for to get right is combining that CRM with your PLG flow. So when someone comes in, you actually want to make sure that you do that linking that we talked about earlier, because once you have that linking right, no matter what tool you're looking at, you're going to be able to link all that information and do really cool analysis. And so I think to start from the foundation there is really the most important thing, and it's just going to pay off a lot of dividends.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Great question. I think Rosina had her question next, but she just asked. Thanks. Rosina, are you still with us? Oh, she dropped. Any other questions from anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking on the other point on transitioning from sales-led to product-led. I think key actually is product-led doesn't mean your sales team like is out of a job, right? So I think like we were talking earlier that during SaaStr, all the sales-led people were like feeling like a little out of place because everyone was talking about PLG. I think really it's the reason why I talked a lot earlier in the presentation about operationalizing sales teams is it's all about kind of changing how sales teams operate to kind of be more product informed. So getting them to actually understand when this happens, this is what you should do. So like defining those like PLG playbooks. So I think that's another really big like time commitment that people have to spend, just like rethinking kind of their playbooks and how are they actually going to kind of insert product metrics and make more product informed decisions.
That's a good point.
Hey Diana, actually on that point, I had a question. Like, have you seen roles evolve from a traditional sales to a PLG sales model? Like, are the SDRs kind of having to come in with a different sort of skill set? Is their role just very different, or are you hiring kind of specific people to kind of run point on this? Is anything different there on kind of the team composition standpoint for PLG?
We've been seeing a couple different trends. I'll kind of just spitball some of them. What's interesting, I think, is in the traditional customer success role in sales-led companies, I think a lot of times customer success is kind of expected to identify an expansion opportunity. And what we've been seeing in product-led is actually sales takes that on. So I think that's kind of a muscle that sales doesn't necessarily do very often, this expansion motion. So that's one thing. On the SDR side, I don't think we've necessarily observed a significant change on the PLG side, because at the end of the day, like the SDR is just going out there, talking to people and qualifying. I think the main difference is just the leads that you're inputting to them for them to go reach out to. So with PLG, you'll use a product qualified lead, whereas in like a traditional world, you might do like a marketing qualified lead. So that's the only difference. But I think if I haven't seen SDRs be significantly different, but maybe this will change over time.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, I've kind of heard of this like product specialist role that maybe kind of comes up right alongside an SDR, where the task is more to like sit down with the customer and kind of be more of a sort of a consultant, as they use the product, kind of find more value out of it. But I think that makes sense. And I apologize for not being on video. My internet connection is not super great, but really appreciate you kind of putting this this presentation together. This is super helpful.
Oh yeah, that's fine. The product specialist role I think is really interesting. You know, in that sense, I do think that like even AEs are expected more to be, I would call like product consultants than necessarily just like continuously selling people. So you know, I guess I see where you're coming from now that you're talking about this like difference in difference in talent.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely an evolving space.
Yeah.
Hey, Diana, I have a question for you real quick. First off, thank you so much for the presentation today. I thought this was awesome. Secondly, I just wanted to ask a question around like the role of, connecting, you mentioned Stripe like really early in your data stack, in terms of, I think it was events is how you put that in there. Can you speak into, how have you seen teams interact with revenue data, really early, and how does that maybe like, indicate, success or growth opportunities? Obviously, increasing revenue is great, but what are some other actions that people take off of the revenue data as you maybe go downstream, through the tech stack, if that makes sense?
I think Stripe is an interesting one. The most common cases we see is people either pipe things from Stripe or they'll pipe their Stripe data into Snowflake and treat the Stripe data as kind of like a firmographic data source. On kind of signals, I've mostly found that Stripe data tends to be an outcome. So like whenever you're kind of like looking at PLG signals, you want to drive everyone towards an outcome. So the Stripe like increase in revenue is the main outcome you're going after. So I'd call it it's probably more of a lagging signal. I think the signals that happen before the revenue is the usage metric that's correlated to revenue. So like maybe like if you in Stripe, you have like usage tiers. So the most common signal that we see people build is tell me when someone is 80% hitting 80% of utilization. So I'm going to go talk to those people so that I can kind of understand their use case and sell them even more. And that's kind of
Right.
Once you've done that, then you get that Stripe signal.
Yeah, just follow up to that, you mentioned like leading indicators or kind of leading indicators, but not able to like, it's
Right.
kind of specific, maybe, to the specific motion or product or, use cases. But in general, if you were to advise somebody at the outset of this, like, hey, these are leading indicators that we have found are generally important, things like sign up and you say product usage. But I'm wondering if like, do you see like, yeah, if they use it 5 consecutive days or if they invite multiple team members, I think Slack said, what was it, 1,000 messages shared was like their biggest signal. I just wondered if you had any generalizations for that.
Yeah, I think every company is different, and what we've discovered is that the sales team often has a gut feel for what the general, I guess, territory of where these signals might live, and it's often highly dependent on, like I was mentioning earlier, what are those actions that are linked to your pricing model. So if you're pricing on usage, it's usage. If you're pricing on seats, it's seats, right? So I think those are kind of the ones I'd look at first. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is we've found that it's very, very, very hard to actually do machine learning on some of this data. And the reason being is like, if you're a company, you have like 100 customers, that's like 100 data points. So it's not enough to actually get a model that makes sense. So when you think about leading indicators, I think the best way to kind of go about it is to think about your pricing model and kind of find those levers that like map to your pricing model. The other common thing that we do for people is just doing something simple like, here's like my cohort of like people that I like. So these are like people who are paying more than $100, maybe something like that. And then let me compare their product usage or other like firmographic data with the cohort that's not paying. And then if you just find a couple interesting trends, you can start building signals around that and just keep tweaking. Because I think a lot of times like we want this to be a science, but it just like isn't a science. And on the second point, I think the signals piece, there's kind of two use cases for signals. There's one like being able to predict a customer, which would be amazing. But then there's also the second signal of just being able to do more personalized outreach. So when you reach out to someone, you'll be like, oh, I know you did X, Y, and Z. So this is why I'm reaching out, because I feel like you could do ABC. And that is actually just also kind of a value add that's a little bit harder to measure, but is another way to kind of use these indicators.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your answer.
Great questions. Any other questions from anyone else, whether that's in the chat or in here that you want to just unmute yourself and just ask Deanna straight away? If not, if people do have questions after Deanna, is there an easy way to reach somebody from Correlated or you? Where can people best find you if they have more questions later on?
Yeah, I think the best way to reach out is to connect with me on LinkedIn, and then feel free to message me at any time. And that's probably the best way, because we're very active on LinkedIn, so I'll probably see it if you if you ping me.
That's a great question from Lars here. Is the CRM still the right place for reps to do PLG?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I will have a controversial answer, which is yes. I think for the next 2 to 4 years, yes. And a lot of if you are looking at kind of the PLG CRM space, I don't know what people say, but they might say that reps shouldn't be in the CRM. I think in all reality, the friction to get someone off the CRM is really high, and you don't want to force people to use a tool that they're not ready to use yet. So I'd say for at least the next, let's say 2 years, you should still think about the CRM as a place where your reps should be looking at. That doesn't mean they won't look at other tools, but you don't throw away your CRM. Oh, what changes in 2 years? That's a great question. I think, I mean, in my mind, I think the CRM is, everyone is treating the CRM like a data warehouse. So the current trend right now is people are storing all of their accounts and all of their contacts in the CRM, and then they're piping all this crazy data, the last 7 signups in the last 7 days, or how many things they did. They're treating it like a data warehouse, and the CRM is not meant to be a data warehouse. And what that does is it causes a lot of problems when you have a downstream application trying to tap into the CRM. It's just literally not scalable. So I think what changes in the next 2 years is there are these core kind of functions that a salesperson does in the CRM that other tools don't do right now, which is really around task management or looking up a customer and all of that. Over the next 2 years, I think a lot of these PLG CRMs are going to start building tools that allow you to do that. And I think that's when you'll start really reconsidering whether or not you actually want that CRM as your source of truth for the reps to be in. But obviously, in order to disrupt a space, it takes a little bit of time to get to that feature parity. And so that's kind of why I think it'll take a little bit of time.
Great questions. That really does get everybody thinking about that. And Lars just said thanks. It makes a lot of sense. Any other questions from anyone else? Well, if not, look for Deanna on LinkedIn, and she's happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much, Deanna, for showing up here, and for everybody else, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. We'll be sharing the recording of this within 24 to 48 hours. So
I think there's one last question. Do we want to answer that one before we leave?
Oh yeah, for sure. That was just came right in.
It came right in while you were closing out.
Sure, Anthony. Yeah. How do you retain a sales-led team to PLG? Yeah, great question.
How do you retrain one? I think it really goes back to defining those playbooks. So what we've seen work well is kind of the senior management of the sales teams, maybe the manager of a sales, each region will come together and kind of define what they view as 5 of the key workflows people want to do. Maybe if your company goal is expansion, you kind of put down, okay, if someone is hitting 80% utilization, you want to reach out with this particular template. And so I think building out those playbooks is kind of the first step to retraining a sales-led team. And then as everyone kind of rinses repeat, showing them the reports, showing them that they're getting value, that they're actually finding new insights. That's kind of how you move everyone past. But I do think someone needs to be that visionary to really create those playbooks first.
Makes sense. Well,
all righty.
That's the last question. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks again, Deanna, for
thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
See y'all later. Bye.